The groom stood nervously at the altar, his heart racing. The doors were about to open, and his bride was moments away from walking down the aisle. But just as the music began to play, something unexpected happened. The doors creaked open, and everyone in the room turned to see who was walking in, and what they saw would change everything. The groom stood at the altar, his hand slightly trembling as he adjusted his tie. The sound of the wedding guests' murmurs faded as he stared ahead, trying to focus. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Amelia, the love of his life, was about to walk down the aisle and become his wife. The thought of it should have filled him with joy, but instead he felt a knot in his stomach that wouldn't go away. He glanced at his best man, a look of concern crossing his face. His palms were slick with sweat. Then, just as the priest began to speak, a faint sound of creaking doors reached his ears. It wasn't part of the ceremony. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of the wedding party. The guests began to shift in their seats, turning around to see what was happening. The room was filled with a mix of curiosity and surprise. The bride had yet to appear, and now something was intruding upon the sacred moment. He froze. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the doors slowly creak open. The figure that appeared in the doorway was vague at first, the soft light from the hall framing the silhouette. Then, as the figure stepped forward, his world seemed to stop. His breath caught in his throat. There she was, Elena, the woman he thought he had left behind, the one he thought he'd forgotten. For a moment, it felt like everything else had disappeared. The bride, the guests, the wedding, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered now was Elena, standing there, her eyes meeting his. She looked different, older, but her presence was undeniable. The emotions that had been buried deep inside him flooded back, rushing over him like a wave he couldn't avoid. Amelia, his soon-to-be wife, stood at the back, her face a mask of confusion. The guests around her whispered in shock, but Daniel couldn't hear them. His focus was entirely on Elena. He was supposed to be marrying Amelia today, but seeing Elena, the woman who had been his world before everything changed, made him question everything. Elena's eyes briefly softened, but then, just as quickly, they hardened. Her face was stoic, but the weight of her presence spoke volumes. She had the same look in her eyes as when she left him years ago. The pain, the betrayal. It was all there, but it was buried under a layer of calm detachment. Is this some kind of joke? Amelia's voice cut through the tension, sharp and demanding. Her grip on Daniel's arm tightened, but he barely noticed. He didn't want to take his eyes off Elena, but the reality of the situation hit him like a punch in the gut. He was about to marry someone else, yet all his emotions were tied up in the woman who had once been his everything. His mind raced. What was she doing here? How did she even find out about the wedding? The guilt surged again, mixed with a deep sense of longing. Elena had always been there for him, supporting him when no one else would, believing in him when he didn't believe in himself. He had taken her for granted, and now she was standing in front of him, pregnant, and yet not a word had been spoken between them for months. He had left her to chase a dream, to chase success. He had told himself it was for their future, but deep down, he knew it had all been for his ego, for the image of himself he was trying to project to the world. And in doing so, he had destroyed the one thing that truly mattered, their love. Amelia tugged at his arm again, her voice now dripping with venom. "Daniel, what's going on? Who is she?" But Daniel couldn't speak. He just stared at Elena, hoping she would say something, anything, to explain why she was here, to explain why the world felt like it was crumbling beneath him. Elena finally broke the silence. "I'm just here to watch," she said quietly, her voice steady but cold. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I just needed to be here, to see this for myself." She looked at Daniel, and for a brief second, her eyes softened. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She turned away from him, the moment slipping away as she began walking down the aisle, away from the altar. Daniel stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. His thoughts were racing, memories of their time together flashing before his eyes. He had hurt her, he had torn them apart with his ambition, and now she was here, carrying his child, and he couldn't even find the words to apologize. Amelia, furious and confused, moved closer to Daniel. She was no longer the calm, collected woman she had been just moments ago. Her smile had faded, replaced by a look of pure frustration. "You're not going to let her ruin this, are you?" she demanded, her voice low but insistent. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was still on Elena. She had walked in as if she had every right to be there. And in that moment, Daniel realized that maybe, just maybe, she did. Later, as the ceremony continued, Daniel found himself unable to concentrate on anything but Elena's presence in the room. He had tried to push her out of his mind for so long, but seeing her again, especially in this way, brought all of his buried feelings to the surface. The baby. She was pregnant with his child. He had no idea when or how that happened, but the weight of it was undeniable. The past he had tried so hard to escape was now staring him in the face, and there was no running from it. The reception, which was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration, felt more like a suffocating cloud around him. He tried to smile and speak to his guests, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew he had to confront Elena. He knew he had to make things right. But where could he even begin? The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how he had failed her. When the evening wore on and the guests danced and laughed, Daniel excused himself from the festivities. He found himself walking through the corridors of the venue, aimlessly searching for Elena. He had to speak to her. He had to understand why she was here and what it meant for their future. He finally found her in a quiet hallway, away from the crowd. Elena stood with her back to him, looking out of a window. The dim light from the hallway cast shadows across her face, making her look almost ethereal. She seemed lost in thought, as if the weight of the moment was too much for her to bear. "Elena," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't turn around immediately, but when she did, her eyes met his. There was no anger, no resentment in her gaze, just an empty space where something once lived. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a sadness he couldn't ignore. I don't know," he stammered. "I need to know why you're here. Why now? What am I supposed to do with all of this?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "You don't get to decide that, Daniel, not anymore." Her words cut through him, sharper than any physical blow. "You had your chance. You chose her. You chose your career over everything that mattered." Her words stung, but Daniel didn't argue. He couldn't. Because she was right. He had chosen success over love, and now he was facing the consequences. "Elena, I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I messed up, I see that now. I've always seen it. I just didn't want to admit it." Her eyes softened just the slightest bit, but she shook her head. "You're sorry, but that doesn't change anything. I'm not here to forgive you. I'm just here to see if you've learned anything." And just like that, she turned away again, leaving him standing there, broken and confused, unsure of how to move forward. The silence between them felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. Daniel stood there, staring at Elena's back as she walked away. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of guilt and confusion, but most of all, there was a deep, aching regret. What was he supposed to do now? He had tried to escape his past, tried to bury it under the shiny new life he had built with Amelia. But here, in front of him, was the reality he had ignored for too long. Elena, his Elena. The woman who had stood by him when no one else would, the woman who had believed in him before anyone else had. And now she was here, with a child growing inside her. His child. Daniel tried to call after her, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? Sorry? That felt hollow. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She had already made it clear that he didn't deserve her forgiveness, not after all the damage he'd done. Still, he couldn't just let her walk away. He couldn't lose her again, not when he finally realized the truth. But when Elena turned the corner and disappeared down the hallway, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Amelia's voice broke through his thoughts. "Daniel, what are you doing?" Her sharp tones snapped him back to the present. He turned to find her standing just a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her once perfect smile was gone, replaced by a frown of concern and frustration. "What is going on? Who is that woman?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but found that he had no answer. How could he explain everything? How could he explain the years of mistakes, the selfish choices that had led him to this point? He couldn't. Amelia wouldn't understand. She didn't know Elena the way he did, the way he used to. I don't know Amelia," Daniel said, his voice sounding foreign, even to him. She's someone from my past." He knew that wasn't enough. It was vague. It was a lie. But it was all he could manage at that moment. Amelia stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for answers. "She's not just someone from your past, Daniel. You were staring at her like—" She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "Like you were seeing a ghost." Daniel flinched. That was exactly how it felt. Seeing Elena again was like a ghost rising from the past, one he had tried to bury, but it refused to stay dead. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it all flooded back, overwhelming him. "I have to talk to her," he muttered, barely able to meet Amelia's gaze. He knew it was wrong, that it wasn't fair to Amelia, but he didn't care. He couldn't leave things like this. He had to know what Elena wanted, why she was here, and what he could do to fix it. Before Amelia could respond, he turned on his heel and started walking toward the exit, his mind racing. He needed to find Elena. He needed to hear her say something, anything, that would give him some sense of closure. But more than that, he needed to make things right. He owed her that much. As he walked through the quiet corridors of the venue, the sounds of the celebration faded away behind him. The music, the laughter, the toasts. All of it felt like a distant memory now. His world had shifted in an instant, and nothing was the same. He found Elena standing alone near the back of the venue, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she looked out of a small window. Her back was to him, but he could see the way her shoulders were stiff, as if she was bracing herself for something. Daniel's heart ached as he took a step forward. "Elena!" he called softly, his voice cracking as he spoke her name. She didn't turn around at first, but he saw her take a deep breath, as if she was preparing herself for whatever conversation they were about to have. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. There was no anger, no hatred, just a quiet sadness that seemed to fill the space between them. "I didn't expect to see you here," Daniel said, his voice low. He didn't know what else to say. The words didn't seem to matter anymore. Elena's gaze softened, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "I didn't expect to be here either," she said quietly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "But I needed to see it. I needed to see you." Daniel took another step toward her, unable to keep the distance. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I should have never let things end the way they did. I should have fought for us." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. The years of silence, the months of confusion, they all melted away in that single moment. But Elena didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. "You should have fought, Daniel," she said softly, the words heavy with pain. "But you didn't. And now I'm standing here with your child, and you've built a life with someone else." She paused, her voice breaking as she added, "You didn't even notice I was gone until now." The guilt hit him like a wave. She was right. He had been so focused on his success, so obsessed with his career, that he had let everything else slip away. He had let her slip away, and now Here she was carrying their child, and he had no idea how to make up for all that time lost. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Daniel said, his throat tight with emotion. "But I need you to know that I regret everything, every choice I made that led me to this moment." For the first time since he had walked into the venue, Elena's expression softened just slightly. But it was enough. "Regret doesn't fix anything," she said quietly. "I don't need your regret, Daniel. I don't need your apologies. I just needed you to see me, to see what you did." Her words stung, but they also gave him clarity. He had spent so much time hiding from the past, trying to bury his mistakes, but now, standing before Elena, he knew he had to face it. He had to confront what he had done and the person he had become. "I'm here now," Daniel said, his voice full of determination, "and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to fix this. I promise you that." Elena shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You can't just fix it, Daniel. It's not that easy." But even as she said that, Daniel could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe? Or maybe just the smallest glimmer of the love they once shared. He wasn't sure, but he couldn't let go of the feeling that, deep down, she still cared. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. As Elena turned to leave, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, Daniel stood frozen. His wedding, the one he had been so sure of just hours ago, felt like a distant memory. It no longer mattered. What mattered now was the chance to fix the mess he had made, to try to win back the love of the woman he had lost. He would do whatever it took. The night wore on, but Daniel's mind was no longer on the reception. The laughter, the toasts, and the soft melodies playing in the background felt like distant noises. He could barely hear them over the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. The uncertainty of what had just transpired with Elena gnawed at him. His wedding, the one he had been so sure of, no longer felt like the right thing. The woman he was supposed to marry, Amelia, was now just a blur in his mind. All he could think about was the woman who had walked out of his life years ago but never really left his heart, Elena. He glanced at his phone, mindlessly scrolling through messages from his colleagues, congratulatory messages from friends. But they meant nothing. Nothing compared to the weight of the moment he had just shared with Elena. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, so close yet so far away. The softness in her eyes, the quiet strength that she carried, even while she was clearly hurt. The way she had walked away from him, still carrying the weight of their broken past on her shoulders, made his stomach churn. Amelia, still beaming with excitement earlier in the evening, now sat at the head table surrounded by their friends and family. She had no idea about what had just transpired. Daniel couldn't bring himself to tell her. What could he say? How could he explain the guilt, the shame, the realization that Elena had been the one who truly mattered? Amelia had been nothing but supportive throughout their relationship, but there was always something missing, something he hadn't even known was missing, until Elena walked back into his life. He couldn't just walk away from the life he had built, not so easily. Amelia had been there for him when he was climbing the ladder of success. She had stood by him through the good times and the bad, and he had convinced himself that she was the one. But standing in front of Elena had shattered that illusion. There was no denying it now. He had made a mistake. It didn't take long for him to make a decision. He stood up abruptly, excusing himself from the table. He needed to find Elena again. He needed answers, and he needed to do what he should have done years ago, take responsibility for the life he had neglected. Walking through the corridors of the venue, Daniel felt as though he was walking through a fog. His thoughts were scattered, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just let Elena slip away again. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult it was. As he reached the rear entrance of the venue, he noticed the soft glow of lights shining through the windows of the back hallway. It was quiet here, away from the bustling noise of the celebration. He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. Would Elena even want to speak to him again? Would she even let him explain himself? But before he could second-guess himself, he spotted her, standing by the exit, her back to him, looking out into the night. She had that same composed expression, the one she wore when she was trying to keep everything under control. She hadn't noticed him yet, so Daniel quietly approached her, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. "Elena?" he said gently, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. She turned, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw him, but there was no hostility, just weariness. "What now, Daniel?" she asked, her tone even but laced with something he couldn't quite place. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm, despite the emotions crashing inside him. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't just let this go. I can't pretend everything is fine." Elena took a deep breath and shook her head slowly. "It's too late for that," she replied quietly. "You can't just show up here after all this time and expect things to be okay. You've made your choices. I've made mine." Daniel's heart sank. "I know I've messed up, but I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking you to let me show you that I can be the man you once believed in, the man you deserved." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze piercing, as though she were searching for any sign of sincerity. "Do you really think it's that simple? That you can just waltz back into my life and make everything okay?" Elena's voice was soft, but the bitterness was clear. "I've spent so long healing from everything you did. I'm not that girl anymore, Daniel. I'm not the one who used to hang on your every word. I've built a life without you, and it's been hard, but it's mine." Daniel took a step closer, his heart aching at the distance between them. He understood her pain, her anger. "I don't expect you to just forgive me, Elena. I know I don't deserve that. But I've spent these years trying to convince myself that what I was doing, working, building my empire, was for us, for our future. But I was wrong. I was selfish, and I can't keep running from the truth." Elena looked away, her hand tightening on the railing. "And what truth is that?" she asked, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "That I still love you," Daniel said, his voice raw. "I never stopped. I've been living in a lie, pretending that all the wealth, the success, the attention meant more than you. And now here we are, and I realize that none of it matters. It never did." The silence between them felt suffocating. Elena turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the truth in his expression. "You left me for all of that, and now you're telling me you love me? After everything?" "I was stupid," Daniel admitted, his voice cracking with regret. "I didn't understand what I had until it was too late. But I swear, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until I make things right." Elena didn't speak for a long time. She simply stared at him, her face softening just the slightest bit. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, but he had to believe that somewhere, buried beneath the anger and pain, there was still a part of her that cared. "I don't know, Daniel," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore. You had your chance. I gave you everything, and you walked away." "I know," he said, his heart breaking. "But I'm not walking away now. Please just give me a chance to show you that I can be better, for you, for our child." Elena's gaze softened for a brief moment, but she quickly composed herself again. "I don't know if that's possible," she whispered, "but I'm willing to see if you mean it. I'm willing to see what you do next." Daniel's heart surged with both relief and anxiety. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a happy ending, but it was a chance. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. As the night continued, Daniel felt as if everything around him was moving in slow motion. The hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of guests. It all seemed so distant, like he was trapped in a world that no longer fit him. He couldn't remember what was said after his conversation with Elena, couldn't remember the polite exchanges he had with guests, or even Amelia's attempts to pull him back into the festivities. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Elena and the baby, thoughts that wouldn't let him rest. He knew it was dangerous, this pull he still felt toward her. He had spent years building his empire, telling himself that he was doing it all for a future they would share. But now, standing in the wreckage of that dream, he saw how foolish he had been. He had convinced himself that wealth and status would fill the emptiness he felt when they grew apart. But all they had done was magnify the hollow space in his heart. Amelia tried to engage him in conversation, but it felt like he was speaking to her through a fog. He could hear her, but her words were drowned out by the pounding of his heart in his ears. Every time his gaze flickered toward the door, he thought he saw a glimpse of Elena walking away, disappearing into the night. He wondered if she was as lost as he felt, if she was still carrying the weight of everything he had put her through. When the night finally wound down and the guests began to leave, Daniel excused himself from the reception. He told Amelia that he wasn't feeling well, that he needed some air. She gave him a concerned look, but didn't press. She had no idea what had really happened, no idea that the foundation of their relationship had crumbled in the span of a few hours. He left the venue, stepping out into the cool night air, hoping it would clear his head, but instead it only made him feel more isolated. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but they felt far away. Everything felt distant. The drive to Elena's apartment felt like it took an eternity. Daniel's thoughts raced. What was he doing? How could he expect Elena to welcome him back into her life after all that had happened? But when he thought about the life they could have had, when he thought about the child growing inside her, he knew he couldn't walk away from this. He had already walked away from her once, and it had ruined everything. He wouldn't make that mistake again. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he turned down a narrow street lined with modest apartment buildings. Elena's place wasn't much, nothing like the grand penthouse he had come to think of as home, but it was hers. It was real. It was the life she had built without him, and as much as it hurt, he had to respect that. He pulled into the parking lot and parked in front of her building. His heart was in his throat as he walked up to her door. For a moment he stood outside, unsure of what to do next. The last time he had seen her, she had been so guarded, so distant. What if she didn't want to see him again? What if he was just a reminder of everything she had tried to leave behind? He couldn't bear the thought of losing her for good, but the fear of rejection held him in place, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He took a deep breath and rang it anyway. A few moments later, Elena opened the door. She looked tired, but not angry. Her eyes, though guarded, softened when she saw him. There was a pause, as if she were deciding whether or not to invite him in, but then, to his surprise, she stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "I wasn't expecting you," she said quietly, though her voice lacked the sharpness it had earlier. Daniel stepped inside, taking in the simple but cozy surroundings. There was no lavish decor here, no display of wealth or grandeur. Just a woman who had been through hell and was doing her best to rebuild. He could see a crib tucked in the corner of the room, soft baby clothes folded neatly on the couch, and a framed ultrasound photo on the fridge. It was a small, quiet life, but it was hers, and that was all that mattered. "I didn't know where else to go," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been thinking about what you said. I know I messed up, and I'm not going to pretend that I can undo what I did. But I want to be here now. I want to be here for you and for our child. I want to make it right." Elena didn't respond immediately. She just walked over to the couch and sat down, her posture stiff, her arms crossed. She was still keeping her distance, still trying to protect herself. "You can't just show up here and expect everything to be okay," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "You don't get to decide when you're ready to step back into my life, Daniel. It doesn't work like that." Daniel nodded, the sting of her words hitting harder than he expected. He knew she was right. He had no right to expect her to welcome him back just because he had finally come to his senses. "I know," he said quietly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to just trust me. But I need you to know that I'm not the same man I was before. I'm not the man who walked away from you. I can't undo the past, but I can show you that I'm here now, that I'm serious about making things right." Elena's gaze softened, just a little, but she still didn't speak. Instead, she looked down at her hands, as though she were considering something. After a long pause, she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice a little quieter now. "It's not just about what you want, it's about what I need. I don't need you to fix things for me. I've been doing just fine on my own, Daniel. I've had to." The words stung, but they also cut through the fog in his mind. Elena had been carrying all of this weight by herself, building a life for their child without him, and he hadn't been there to help her. The realization was humbling. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I wasn't there for you, but I want to be now. I want to prove that I can be the man you need, the man I should have been all along." Elena was silent for a moment, her eyes never leaving his. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Prove it," she said softly. "Don't tell me. Show me." And in that moment, Daniel realized that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be about grand gestures or promises he couldn't keep. It would be about the small, everyday actions that proved he had changed, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn her trust back, one step at a time. As he stood there, watching her, Daniel knew that he was ready for whatever came next. The road to redemption wouldn't be quick or easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Daniel. He spent his days buried in work, trying to keep his mind occupied, but at night his thoughts always returned to Elena. He found himself constantly second-guessing every move he made, wondering if he was doing enough, if he was doing it right. He was trying, but there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that it was too late, that Elena had moved on, and that his actions could never undo the hurt he had caused her. Despite the quiet tension between them, he kept showing up. He brought her groceries, baby clothes, and occasionally something small to remind her that he was there, that he wasn't going to give up. He didn't push her. He didn't demand anything from her. He simply made sure she knew he was there, whether she was ready to talk or not. Elena had made it clear that she didn't want him to fix things with grand gestures, and Daniel understood that. She didn't need him to buy her expensive gifts or apologize repeatedly. She needed consistency. She needed to see that he wasn't going to walk away again. So Daniel focused on proving his sincerity through the smallest of actions. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything seemed to suffocate him. He had made so many mistakes in the past, and every time he thought about their life together, he felt the sharp sting of regret. But when he saw Elena, when he saw the way she was doing everything she could to raise their child on her own, his resolve hardened. He couldn't let her do this alone, not when he had a chance to make things right. One evening, after he had dropped off a bag of groceries, Elena stopped him before he could leave. She stood in the doorway, her posture slightly less guarded than it had been before. There was a softness in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative, "about what you said, about proving it." She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I'm not ready to trust you yet, Daniel, but I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to let you show me that you're serious." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The words she spoke weren't an outright declaration of forgiveness, but they were the closest thing to hope he had gotten in a long time. He wanted to speak, to tell her how much it meant, but instead he just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. This was his chance, a fragile chance, but it was real. "I won't let you down," he promised, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "I'll prove to you, day by day, that I'm here for you, and for our child." Elena didn't respond right away, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. The small opening, the willingness to see where this might go, was enough for Daniel. It was all he needed to keep going. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel continued his quiet campaign of consistency. He showed up to doctor's appointments, even if Elena didn't always want him there. He stayed quiet, respectful, never pushing too hard for her attention, but always making sure she knew he was there. There were moments of tension, of course. There were days when Elena seemed to retreat into herself, when the wall she had built around her heart felt impossible to break through. But Daniel knew he had to be patient. He couldn't rush her healing. He had spent years hurting her. He would give her the time she needed to heal at her own pace. One afternoon, Daniel arrived at Elena's apartment to find her sitting on the couch, a baby name book open in front of her. She didn't notice him at first, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway watching her. It was strange. In that moment, he saw her not just as the woman he had lost, but as the mother of his child. She was already preparing for their future, a future that was no longer just about him. She was strong, independent, and fiercely protective of the life she was building, and that thought both terrified and amazed him. "Hey," he said softly, stepping into the room. Elena looked up, her eyes softening just a little when she saw him. She hadn't looked at him with that level of vulnerability in weeks, and it made his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and fear. "Hey," she replied, closing the book and setting it aside. There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, just quiet acceptance, as though they had somehow found a place between them where neither of them was expecting anything from the other. They were simply there, sharing the space. He sat down on the couch beside her, keeping a careful distance, but not enough to make it feel like a cold separation. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, glancing at the book. Elena shrugged, her gaze flicking down at the pages she had been flipping through. "Names. We've got to figure out what we're going to call this kid, right?" There was a hint of a smile in her voice, but it was small, cautious, like she wasn't quite sure how much she was allowed to give. "I've been thinking about that too," Daniel said, trying to keep his tone light. "I'm open to suggestions." Elena laughed quietly, the sound soft and almost reluctant. "You're not really picky, are you?" she teased. "Nope," Daniel replied with a grin, trying to match her playful tone. "I'm just here for the ride. Whatever you decide, I'm in." For a brief moment, they both seemed to forget the heavy past that had brought them here. There was no pressure, no weight of the mistakes they had both made. There was just a quiet, simple connection, a shared understanding that, despite everything, they were in this together now. Elena didn't immediately offer him an answer, but there was something in her eyes that made Daniel feel like they were moving towards something. Not a perfect future, not an idealized version of their lives, but a real one. A future where they both had a chance to heal and rebuild, one step at a time. "I'm glad you're here," Elena said softly, her voice sincere. The words were simple, but they held more weight than anything else she had said in weeks. Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd had in a long time. "I'm glad I'm here too." For the first time since that fateful day when he had walked down the aisle to marry Amelia, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a beginning, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he had hope. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel felt the weight of his past slowly lifting, but only a little. Every time he showed up at Elena's apartment, every time he helped her carry groceries or attended a doctor's appointment, it felt like he was building a fragile bridge between them. Elena was still cautious, still protective of herself, but there were small moments, fleeting glances, quiet smiles, that told Daniel she was beginning to trust him again, even if just a little. One evening, after another routine visit, Elena invited him to sit down with her and talk. This wasn't a common occurrence. Most of their interactions were brief and focused on practical matters, but this time it felt different. Elena had asked him to stay for dinner, and although she was careful not to make it sound too significant, Daniel could feel the weight of it. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Elena had made a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but the comfort of the moment wasn't lost on Daniel. He hadn't realized how much he had missed moments like this, moments where things were just normal. They ate in silence for a while, both of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was just real. They weren't pretending anymore. After they finished eating, Elena took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tapping on the edge of her plate. She looked at him, her eyes searching, as if trying to gauge if he was really ready for what she was about to say. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice a little softer than usual, "about everything, about us. And I don't know what I'm supposed to feel anymore, Daniel." Daniel felt his chest tighten. This was the moment, the one he had been both waiting for and dreading. He had been so focused on proving that he was here, showing up consistently, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what would happen when Elena finally voiced her doubts. But now, here it was, and he had to face it. "I know," Daniel said quietly, trying to sound calm, trying not to let the fear in his heart show. "I know it's been a lot, and I know you're not sure yet, but I'm not asking you to rush anything, Elena. I'm just asking for the chance to keep proving to you that I'm serious, that I'm here for you, not for the past, but for the future." Elena didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Daniel couldn't tell what she was thinking, but he could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was weighing his words, maybe even weighing his actions, and trying to decide what they meant. "Sometimes I feel like I've been carrying this baby alone," Elena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I get it. I really do. You were caught up in your world, and I was too broken to keep fighting for us. But now, every time I see you, I wonder if you're really ready, if you're ready to step up, and if you're not, I need to know that I'm doing the right thing." Daniel felt his heart break a little at her words. She had been carrying so much by herself, and now, after everything, she was questioning whether he was truly ready to be a part of it. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and it was something he wasn't sure he could fully carry, but he was damn well going to try. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Daniel said, his voice full of conviction. He reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. "I made mistakes, huge mistakes, but I've learned. I've learned that I can't keep living in the past. I have to be here for you, for our child. I'm not asking you to forget everything I've done, but I am asking you to see me for who I am now, not for the man I was." Elena pulled her hand back slowly, and Daniel's heart sank for a moment. But then she met his gaze, and there was something different in her eyes. A small flicker of hope, maybe, or at least a willingness to let him try. "I'm not going to make promises that I can't keep," Elena said softly, her voice steady. "But I'm willing to give you a chance, Daniel. I'm willing to see what you do with it." Relief washed over him, followed by a rush of gratitude. It wasn't everything he had hoped for, but it was something. And it was enough to keep him going. For the next few days, Daniel continued to be there for Elena. He didn't expect her to change overnight. He knew it was going to take time. Time to rebuild trust, to prove that he was worthy of her love, and time for her to see that he wasn't going anywhere. But there was something different now, something real. The walls between them weren't completely gone, but the cracks in them were starting to show. And that, to Daniel, was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of a small baby store, staring at the display of baby clothes. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew he had to do something. As he walked inside, he found himself lost in the aisles, looking at tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small and delicate. It was overwhelming, yet it felt right. He picked out a small, soft onesie, something simple and neutral in color, and walked up to the counter. The cashier smiled at him, ringing up the purchase, and as she handed him the bag, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. This was real. This was his future now. It wasn't perfect. There were still so many obstacles to overcome, but this was something he could hold on to. Later that evening, when he arrived at Elena's apartment, he knocked on the door, feeling the weight of his actions. When she opened the door, he handed her the small bag, unsure of what her reaction would be. "What's this?" Elena asked, glancing down at the bag in her hands. Daniel smiled, a little nervous. "I thought I'd get something for the baby. I don't really know what I'm doing, but I wanted to start." Elena stood there for a moment, looking down at the bag and then back at him. Her expression softened just slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost too soft for him to hear. But it was enough. It was a gesture, a sign that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to find their way back to each other. "I'm not going anywhere, Elena," Daniel said, his voice steady now. "I'm here, and I'll keep showing up, every day." She didn't say anything, but the smallest of smiles tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel left that night feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally headed in the right direction. As the weeks passed, the tension between Daniel and Elena began to ease. It wasn't an instant transformation, but there were subtle signs that things were slowly shifting. Elena, while still cautious, had started to let him in just a little more. She wasn't leaning on him for support yet, but she no longer turned away when he offered it. She didn't shut him out, as she had in the beginning. Instead, there was a tentative understanding between them, a silent agreement that they were both trying. One evening, as Daniel was leaving another quiet dinner at Elena's apartment, she called him back before he could reach the door. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face lit by the soft glow of the hallway light. She seemed hesitant, as if she was about to say something important, but unsure how to start. "Daniel," she said, her voice a little shaky, as though gathering courage, "I've been thinking a lot about you, about us, and I know it's been hard for both of us, but I don't want you to think that I'm not seeing the changes in you. You've been here. You've been steady." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. The words she had just spoken were more than he had hoped for. There was still so much left to work through, but hearing this from her, hearing her recognize his efforts, gave him hope. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," Daniel said softly, stepping toward her, but still keeping a respectful distance. "I know I can't change everything overnight, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I want to be part of this, part of the future, with you and the baby." Elena looked down for a moment, as if considering something. When she met his eyes again, there was a softness there that hadn't been there before. "I can see that now. And maybe we can figure this out, together." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the first real sign of hope. They weren't fixed. They hadn't suddenly erased all the hurt, all the years of distance and mistakes. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving forward, slowly, cautiously, but still moving forward. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to show up, quietly and steadily. He accompanied Elena to her doctor's appointments, even when she didn't explicitly ask him to. He helped with the small things, picking up things from the store, putting together the baby's crib, just being there, in a way that showed her he wasn't just doing this for the baby, but because he wanted to rebuild their relationship. One day, Elena called him after a particularly difficult appointment. She had found out the baby was going to be born a little earlier than expected, and while everything was fine, the news still left her feeling shaken. She told him she wasn't sure if she could handle everything on her own. When Daniel arrived at her apartment, He found her sitting on the couch, looking worn out, her hands resting lightly on her swollen belly. She looked up when he entered, her face tired, but relieved to see him. "Hey," Daniel said softly, walking over and sitting down beside her. "How are you feeling?" Elena hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know. I thought I could do this alone. But now it feels like everything's happening so fast, and I don't know if I can keep up." Daniel's heart went out to her. He had watched her carry this burden alone for so long, and now that the reality of parenthood was starting to feel real, he could see the cracks in her strength. She had been so independent, so strong for so long, but there were moments when even the strongest people needed someone to lean on. "You don't have to do this alone," Daniel said gently, his voice full of sincerity. "You've never been alone. I'm here. I always have been. And I'm not going anywhere." Elena turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared I've waited too long for you to show up, and now it's too late." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his touch firm and reassuring. "It's never too late, Elena. Not for us. We'll do this together, one step at a time." She didn't say anything, but her hand tightened around his, and in that moment, Daniel felt the walls between them shift just a little more. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The trust, the connection. It was fragile, but it was beginning to take root. Days turned into weeks, and as Elena's due date approached, the anticipation of what was coming began to settle in. Daniel found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before. This wasn't just about him and Elena anymore. This was about their child, the life they were going to build together, and the mistakes they both had to face in order to create something better. The night before Elena was scheduled to go into labor, Daniel stayed with her at her apartment. They spent the evening talking, sharing quiet moments together. There was no pressure, no expectations. They simply sat together, the weight of their past between them, but somehow lighter now, more manageable. "I know we're not perfect," Elena said, breaking the silence, "but I feel like we might actually have a chance, if we keep trying." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I know we do. We'll make it through, Elena. We'll figure it out one step at a time." Elena smiled softly, her eyes warm as she leaned against him. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel like he was losing her. He wasn't sure how long it would take to fully rebuild their relationship, but he knew he was willing to put in the work. He wasn't going anywhere. The next day, Elena went into labor earlier than expected, and as Daniel rushed to the hospital by her side, his thoughts were focused on one thing: being there for her. He had a chance to do right by her now, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The hospital was a blur of activity when Daniel arrived, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Elena had been in labor for hours, and although she had insisted she could handle it alone, Daniel could see the exhaustion in her eyes when he walked into the room. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite all the uncertainty and the walls that had been built over the years, there was something incredibly raw about this moment. She needed him, not because he was her husband or her lover, but simply because he was there. And that, Daniel realized, was something he hadn't understood before. Elena's eyes met his when he entered, and for a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to disappear. She gave him a small, exhausted smile, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. He wasn't sure what she was thinking, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. He wasn't going anywhere. "You're here," Elena said softly, her voice strained but filled with a quiet relief. "I didn't think you'd make it." "I promised I would," Daniel said, walking over to her side and taking her hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere, Elena. I'm here." She nodded, squeezing his hand weakly. "I don't know how to do this, how to be a single parent, how to be strong for this baby. I thought I could do it on my own, but I'm so scared." Daniel felt his heart shatter, as he heard the vulnerability in her voice. He had never truly understood the depth of what she had been carrying all this time. The loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty of being a mother without the support she had once believed she could count on. And now, here she was, on the brink of bringing their child into the world and still carrying so much on her own. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside him. "I'm here, Elena. We'll do this together. I promise." For a moment, Elena didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though weighing the sincerity of his words, and then, just as quickly as the doubt appeared, it faded. She nodded slightly and turned her attention back to the doctors and nurses around her. But Daniel could see the change in her expression, a slight shift, a flicker of hope, as if maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that he was really here to stay. The hours dragged on, and Daniel stayed by Elena's side, never leaving her, never asking for a break. The pain she was going through was overwhelming, and every time she squeezed his hand or breathed heavily through another contraction, Daniel felt the weight of her struggles as if they were his own. He was seeing her in a way he never had before. Vulnerable, raw, and determined to get through this. And in that moment he realized something profound. She had always been strong, stronger than he had ever given her credit for. When the final push came, Elena let out a sharp gasp, her grip tightening on his hand as the doctors guided her through the process. Daniel stood by her, offering whatever comfort he could, but more than that, he was there, a presence in the room, just as he had promised. And when the cries of their newborn baby filled the room, something shifted inside Daniel. It was no longer just about them. It was about this tiny life they had created together. This was their future. And no matter how difficult it had been to get here, it was worth it. The first few days after the birth were a blur of exhaustion, joy, and new beginnings. Daniel found himself in a world he hadn't prepared for, yet somehow it felt exactly right. He spent long hours by Elena's side, helping with the baby, learning how to be a father, even as the weight of his past mistakes still loomed over him. But every time he looked at the baby, at their baby, he felt something inside him shift, as though he had finally found a reason to be better, to do better. Elena was still recovering, both physically and emotionally. The first few days were filled with quiet moments as she rested and adjusted to motherhood, but there was a new kind of quiet between them now. It wasn't strained or uncomfortable. It was a tentative peace. They were still finding their way, still figuring out how to rebuild the pieces of their relationship, but every day they were taking small steps forward. One afternoon, as Elena sat in the rocking chair feeding the baby, Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the world outside. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he watched his family start to take shape. He had come so far from the man he was when he first walked away from her, and yet here they were, together, with a child of their own. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. "I never thought I'd be here," Daniel said softly, his voice almost to himself. He turned to Elena, who was looking down at their child, a small smile playing at her lips. Elena glanced up at him, her expression soft but serious. "You weren't supposed to be here, Daniel, but you are, and that's all that matters now." Her words hung in the air, and Daniel felt a weight settle in his chest. He wasn't sure if he deserved this chance, if he deserved her forgiveness. But as he watched Elena with their child, he knew he would do whatever it took to prove he was worthy of both of them. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself falling deeper into the rhythm of fatherhood. There were moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he was doing enough, but every time he held their baby in his arms, he knew he was where he was meant to be. Elena was still cautious, still not fully trusting him, but every time she looked at him, there was a flicker of something. a spark of the woman he had fallen in love with. They weren't perfect. They hadn't erased all the pain of the past, but they were building something new, one day at a time. Weeks later, as the baby began to grow and change, Daniel and Elena's relationship continued to evolve. There were still bumps in the road, moments of tension when old wounds resurfaced, but for the most part, there was a quiet understanding between them. They were no longer just two people trying to figure out how to co-parent a child. They were two people trying to rebuild their life, trying to figure out how to be a family again. Daniel spent most of his time at the apartment now. He had scaled back his work commitments, focusing instead on being there for Elena and their child. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of his past mistakes threatened to crush him, when he wondered if he could ever make up for the years he had wasted. But he kept going. He kept showing up. He had promised Elena that he would, and he wasn't going to break that promise again. One night, as they sat together on the couch after putting the baby to bed, Elena turned to him, her expression serious. "Daniel," she began softly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us. And I know it's not perfect. I know we're still figuring things out. But I want you to know that I see you. I see the changes in you, and I want to keep trying." Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders at her words. It wasn't an "I forgive you" moment, but it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to rebuild the trust that had been broken. "I'm not perfect," Daniel said quietly, his voice sincere, "but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll keep showing up, Elena, every day, because I love you, and I want to be a part of this. I want to be part of our future." Elena didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at him, her expression softening. And then, without a word, she leaned in and kissed him gently on the lips. It wasn't the kind of kiss that solved everything. It wasn't some grand gesture. It was simple, but it was enough. It was a promise. And in that moment, Daniel realized that this quiet, steady love they were building was what mattered. They weren't perfect, but they were trying, and that was all he could ask for. As the months went by, the small moments of growth between Daniel and Elena continued. They weren't rushing anything. There was no sudden, dramatic shift in their relationship. Instead, they were slowly rebuilding, one day at a time. There were still disagreements, still moments of doubt, but there was something else, too. A quiet understanding that they were doing this together, and that was enough. One morning, as Daniel stood by the window holding their baby, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had a long road ahead of him, but he had a chance to make things right. Elena had given him that chance, and he was going to spend the rest of his life proving that he deserved it. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to waste it. The days stretched on, blending into a routine that felt both comforting and unfamiliar to Daniel. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of his past mistakes pressed heavily on him. But there were also moments of peace, moments where he saw Elena smile at him, genuinely, not out of politeness or obligation, but because she was starting to believe in them again. It was slow, this rebuilding, but it was real, and for Daniel, that was enough. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the baby asleep in the crib nearby, Daniel found himself reflecting on how far they had come. They had both made mistakes. He had made mistakes. But somehow, they were still here, still trying, still moving forward. Elena's presence beside him, her hand resting in his, felt like the anchor he needed. They were learning to trust again, to communicate again, even if it was through the quiet moments and the small gestures. "Elena," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. She looked up from the book she had been reading, her eyes meeting his. There was a calmness in her expression, a steadiness that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their way. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying. I'm trying to be the man I should have been all along." Elena's gaze softened, and she let out a soft sigh. I know, Daniel, and I see it. I see the changes. It's not easy, and I'm not pretending it is. But I think we can figure this out. We're figuring it out, aren't we? Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Yeah, we are. One step at a time. For a long while, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The weight of their words hung in the air between them, but it wasn't a burden. It was something lighter, the promise of progress, of hope. It was moments like this, these quiet, simple moments, that Daniel knew were the foundation of everything they were building. It wasn't the grand gestures or declarations of love that mattered. It was the small, consistent actions, the day-to-day effort that would prove they were ready for the future they were slowly starting to create. The door to their past wasn't completely closed, but it didn't need to be. They both had scars from the years they spent apart, but those scars were also reminders of the strength it took to make it through. And as Daniel looked at Elena, he realized something else. The future was not going to be perfect, but it was going to be theirs. As the months passed, things between Daniel and Elena became more settled. They were no longer two people caught in the aftermath of their broken relationship, trying to piece things together. Instead, they were partners, co-parents, and slowly but surely they were starting to heal. The tension that had once been thick between them had dissipated, replaced by an understanding that while their past could never be erased, it no longer had to define them. They had built a life, a family, and although it hadn't been easy, it had been worth every step. Daniel had learned, through the quiet patience of Elena and the constant effort on his part, what it meant to truly love someone. Not through words or grand gestures, but through actions, through consistency, through being present, no matter what. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, watching their child play on the swings, Elena leaned against Daniel, her head resting on his shoulder. The warmth of the sun on their skin and the sound of their child's laughter felt like a peaceful moment in time, a moment they had earned through all the trials and struggles they had faced. I never thought we'd get here, Elena said quietly, her voice soft as she gazed at the child playing in front of them. I thought it was over. I thought I'd never be able to trust you again. But now I see that maybe we can do this. Together. Daniel smiled, his heart full of emotion. We're doing it, he said softly. Every day we're doing it. As they sat there, in the quiet calm of the afternoon, Daniel realized that this was what he had always wanted. Not the wealth, not the success, not the status, but this. A life shared with Elena, with their child, with the quiet promise that no matter what, they would keep showing up for each other. It wasn't the fairy tale ending he had once imagined. It was better. It was real. And as they stood up to leave the park, hand in hand, Daniel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one step at a time. The following year, things between Daniel and Elena were steadier than ever. They had found their rhythm as parents, as partners, and as individuals, still growing in their own right. The scars of their past, while not forgotten, no longer held the weight they once did. They had become part of the foundation on which they were building something new, something stronger. Daniel had shifted his focus even further away from his career. He still worked, still ran his business, but it wasn't the driving force it had once been. He had come to realize that the true wealth in his life wasn't in boardrooms or investments. It was in the quiet moments at home, in the sound of his child laughing, in the peace of sitting beside Elena at the end of a long day. He had everything he needed right here, right now. There were still challenges. There were still moments of doubt, of old habits creeping in. But with each passing day, Daniel felt more confident in his commitment to Elena and their family. He had learned, over time, that love wasn't just about the grand gestures, the promises. It was about showing up when it mattered most. It was about being present, being consistent, and doing the hard work of rebuilding. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, watching their child play with a new toy, Elena turned to Daniel with a soft smile. "You know," she began, her voice full of quiet sincerity, "I never imagined we'd end up like this. I never thought I'd trust you again after everything that happened. But somehow, here we are. And I'm glad we are." Daniel's heart swelled in his chest. This was it, the culmination of everything they had been working toward. He had no illusions that their life would be perfect. There would be ups and downs, just like in any relationship. But in this moment, as he looked at Elena, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to understand what truly mattered. And it wasn't the career or the accolades. It was this, the family they were building together, one small step at a time. "I'm glad too," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm not going anywhere, Elena. I never will again." She smiled, the warmth in her eyes matching the tenderness in his voice. "I know, and that's all I need." The baby, now a toddler, ran up to them, her small hands reaching out as she laughed. Daniel's chest tightened with a feeling of joy he hadn't known he was capable of. This was what he had wanted all along, the love, the family, the quiet moments that added up to something bigger than he could have ever imagined. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace with the life he had chosen. As the years went by, Daniel and Elena continued to grow together. Their relationship was no longer defined by the past or by the mistakes they had made. Instead, it was defined by the work they had put in, the healing they had both done, and the love they had chosen to give each other day after day. Their child, now a young girl, brought even more joy and light into their lives. They had created something beautiful, something stronger than the broken pieces of their past. Daniel watched as Elena thrived in her role as a mother, as a partner, as a woman who had finally found peace within herself. And he was there beside her every step of the way. A father, a partner, a man who had learned to love in the truest sense. One evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, Elena leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice full of contentment. "We actually did it." Daniel smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "We did," he agreed softly, "and I wouldn't change a thing." The years had been kind to them, but they had earned it. The journey had been long, and it hadn't always been easy. But through it all, they had learned what it meant to truly love and commit to each other. The mistakes of the past no longer weighed them down because they had built something new, something stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel looked at Elena, his hand gently resting on hers. He knew their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and in that there was a beauty that he had never known before. Together they had faced the storm, and together they had found their way back to each other. And in the quiet moments, like this one, as the world slowly settled into night, Daniel realized that no matter what the future held, he would always have this, the love they had fought for, and the family they had created.